So while archaeology confirms that indigenous peoples used aux Meadows for approximately 6,000 years, both long before and shortly after the Norse presence, this history is, often perceived as minimized for several distinct historical, archaeological, and institutional reasons. The first European narrative bias, is pretty clear. Institutional and public interest has historically focused on the Norse because the site represents the first undisputed evidence of European contact in the Americas. National and global significance. Well, for organizations like Parks Canada and UNESCO, the Norse occupation is treated as a unique milestone in human migration. This global significance often, honestly, overshadows the local, continuous indigenous history in mainstream media and educational curricula. Settler identity is another factor to consider. Some scholars argue that the emphasis on Norse history serves a settler narrative, framing early Europeans as the precursors to modern Canada and, occasionally erasing the depth of native space. So the physical remains left behind by the Norse and indigenous occupations are, really quite different when it comes to their visibility and how permanent they are. The Norse, for instance, built these pretty substantial timber-framed turf buildings and even a forge for ironworking. These structures left behind some really prominent visible mounds and, get this, more than 800 artifacts. Indigenous groups, like the maritime archaic Dorset and ancestors of the Beothuk, mostly used the site as a seasonal hunting and fishing camp. Their campsites were usually made up of temporary tents, stone hearths and middens, or waste piles, which honestly are a lot harder to spot and display to the public compared to those big Norse buildings. So, one really notable archaeological finding is that, while indigenous groups used the site for thousands of years, there just isn't any definitive evidence that they were actually present at aux Meadows at the exact same time as the Norse. Research suggests that the Dorset people, they left the area about 200 to 300 years before the Norse arrived. The Little Passage tradition, who are the ancestors of the Beothuk, started using the site around 1200 to 1500 CE, which is about 100 to 200 years after the Norse had already abandoned it. While recent studies from 2019 suggest that Norse activity might have actually lasted longer than we previously thought, potentially until 1145 CE, clear evidence of direct, face-to-face interaction at this specific site is still, pretty sparse. Official designations have, historically, prioritized the Norse discovery as the primary reason for the site's protection. The site was designated a National Historic Site back in 1968 specifically because it was recognized as the first known Viking settlement. So, in recent years, Parks Canada has really increased its efforts to interpret the site as a multicultural landscape. They now explicitly state that the Norse were only one of several groups who lived at aux Meadows. And, they also detail the 6,000-year indigenous history in their on-site and online materials. Let's take a moment to look at the timeline of indigenous occupation at aux Meadows. Now, let's talk about the unusual authentication of aux Meadows. A temporary Norse settlement used for trade in the 12th century was primarily evidenced by the Norwegian husband and wife team Helge Ingstad, who was a self-proclaimed explorer, and Anne Stein Ingstad, who was an uncertified archaeologist. In 1960, local resident George Decker led Helge Ingstad to grassy mounds near the village that locals referred to as an old Indian camp. Architectural remains included 8 timber frame turf buildings, including longhouses and a forge, all identical in style to 11th century structures in Greenland. The most critical find was a bronze ring-headed cloak pin, discovered in 1968. This is a characteristically Norse item and, it wasn't used by indigenous peoples of the region. Among the daily life items, there's a soapstone spindle whorl and a bone knitting needle. These are, interestingly, attributed to indigenous culture. The official records verifying the site's authenticity are held and maintained by several international and federal bodies. Parks Canada Agency, as the current manager of the aux Meadows National Historic Site, maintains the currently contested archaeological reports. In 1978, aux Meadows became the first site named to the UNESCO World Heritage List. Their dossier, reference number 4, contains the official statement of outstanding universal value. Many original artifacts are housed at the Rooms, the Provincial Museum and Archives in Newfoundland, which manages the physical evidence in collaboration with Parks Canada. Recent high-precision dating, published in 2021 in the journal Nature, used solar storm radiocarbon signatures in tree rings to definitively date activity at the site to the year 1021 CE. While archaeology confirms that indigenous peoples used aux Meadows for approximately 6,000 years, both long before and shortly after the Norse presence, this history is often perceived as minimized for several distinct historical, archaeological, and institutional reasons. Thanks for watching!